we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
My last election, after my election, I have more flexibility.
I understand. I trust in this relationship to let you know that.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes.
Mr. Obama, you've said that your religious faith dictates that marriage should be between a man and a woman. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, what I believe is that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
At a certain point, I've just concluded that for me personally, it is important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married.
Yes, we can. 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 Yes, we.
I'll also institute an absolute gift ban so that no registered lobbyist can curry favor with members of my administration based on how much they can spend on a fancy dinner. I'll make our government open and transparent so that anyone can ensure that our business is the people's business. Justice Louis Brandeis once said, "Sunlight is the greatest disinfectant." And as president, I'm going to make it impossible for congressmen or lobbyists to slip pork barrel projects or corporate welfare into laws when no one's looking, because when I'm president, meetings where laws are written will be more open to the public, no more secrecy. That's a commitment I make to you as president. No more secrecy. And when there's a bill that ends up on my desk as president, you, the public, will have 5 days to look online and find out what's in it before I sign it, so that you know what your government's doing. When there are meetings between lobbyists and a government agency, we'll put as many of those meetings as possible online for every American to watch. When there's a tax bill being debated in Congress, you will know the names of the corporations that would benefit and how much money they would get. And we will put every corporate tax break and every pork barrel project online for every American to see. You will know who asked for them, and you can decide whether your representative is actually representing you.
Well, in the past few weeks, the U.S. has witnessed an aggressive crackdown on whistleblowers. For many, the Obama administration's tough investigative stance on unauthorized press leaks goes against the president's own election promise to bring back openness and transparency. Moreover, some journalists now accuse the Obama government of actually attacking press freedom.
In an attempt to silence government leakers, the Obama administration is prosecuting a journalist. James Risen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning national security correspondent for the New York Times, is being told to give up his sources or go to jail. In his 2006 book, he wrote about the botched U.S. intelligence operations to halt Iran's nuclear program. As he's still under prosecutor's scrutiny, Risen is now advised to avoid interviews on the subject.
This issue has been litigated before. It went through the courts 2 years ago. A judge threw out the request for the subpoena. Now the Justice Department, under a new administration, ironically, seems to be going down the same path.
Eric Lichtblau, together with his colleague James Risen, has made a number of groundbreaking revelations, including the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping program. He says confidentiality is vital in their work, as people often put their lives at risk to tell what's really going on behind the scene.
If, in effect, we have a system where journalists can only cover things that the government says are not secret, then journalists have lost their independence. They've lost their ability to act as a check on the government.
There would probably be no discussions on Guantanamo abuses or CIA secret prisons if not for the leaks, but the clampdown is on.
Of course, there is a line between giving up national security secrets and telling the public what they need to know about their government's work. But one or two other cases like Risen's and the Free American Investigative Journalism could face a real drought in sources.
Obama's leak plugging has been welcomed most among advocates of secrecy in government affairs, but even they are surprised.
What came to me as a surprise, the Obama administration came into office pledging maximum openness in government, and while they've taken some steps in that direction, they've also done some unexpected things regarding leaks.
While some journalists have to fight for their sources, others demand transparency at the White House. Like Helen Thomas, who's been in the President Press Corps for over 50 years.
We have never had that in the White House. Too much secrecy in the White House and government. And I think the people have a right to know almost everything.
Meanwhile, Obama, with the new law tucked under his arm, positions the U.S. as the watchdog for the freedom of press in the world.
What this act does is it sends a strong message from the United States government and from the State Department that we are paying attention to how other governments are operating when it comes to the press.
One thing is not clear. Will the State Department pay attention to its own backyard, as American journalists are being forced to break their word? Gainich Chakyan, RT, Washington, D.C.
Yes, we can. 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 Yes, we can.